You're listening to the Faith Breathed Hope podcast, episode number 58. Today I speak with wife, widow, mother, survivor, mentor, and creator of Growing with Grief, Autumn Toelle Jackson, on the journey after losing a spouse. Welcome to the Faith Breathed Hope podcast, where we gain inspiration and motivation from others who share their touching stories of renewing hope and discovering purpose in any circumstance. I'm your host, Christina Reisinger, and today we will be encouraged by another tremendously inspirational topic that will embolden you to release fear, begin taking small steps forward, and move into your God-given purpose to live and serve in this life. Join me for today's story. Hello, Autumn, and welcome to Faith Breathed Hope. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for asking. I'm so glad that you have a chance to come on the show. For those of you who have not followed me in other places, we do an annual virtual grief symposium, and Autumn was one of the speakers at that symposium, and her story is so touching that I asked her to join us on Faith Breathed Hope. So I'm so excited that you're here, and we're going to get into the topic of grieving with kids in just a little bit. But first, I want you to tell the audience a little bit about you, something that's interesting or that you find interesting. So what might we not know about you that we're going to talk about, but may find very interesting?
Let's see. I guess something different or interesting about me is I really love escape rooms. I love solving puzzles and having challenges and doing things that make me think. I think it's become my favorite pastime over movies or other things. I just like being active and trying to come up with solutions to different random problems.
That's really cool. That'll keep you young, right? Your mind will be young.
That's the theory,
awesome.
Right?
Yeah, awesome. So you have an exceptionally, what I think is heartbreaking story. And it's also relatable to probably more people than they think. Maybe not the exact same story because we don't walk in each other's shoes, but there are some parts of our stories that people can relate to. And so I would like for you to share with the audience about your story and have a conversation about how your kids, you are able to help your kids grieve well.
Okay. So my story with grief really started when I was fairly well along in my life. I was married. I had one kid. I didn't really experience much grief earlier, I think prior to being 28 or 29, because we had pets and that was the extent of it. And I had some great grandparents that had passed away or grandparents I didn't know. And so other than losing an occasional pet, I had a really blessed life. And my first real experience with grief happened, like I said, when I was in my late 20s, when my husband and I had one kid and we wanted to have a second kid. And at that point, we had 2 consecutive miscarriages, losing 3 babies. One was twins. And I didn't even know at that point that what I was feeling was grief. I thought I was depressed, but grief wasn't part of my vocabulary, really. Mm-hmm. And so I really struggled with what I was feeling and why I was feeling it. And I felt completely alone, and I felt like I was doing something wrong. It shouldn't be that big of a deal because statistically, 1 in 4 women has a miscarriage and nobody talks about it, which means that everybody's doing great and it's not an issue. And so that was really my introduction with grief.
So statistics and grief don't really go hand in hand. I mean, we can look at what all has been written in books, even scenarios, different stories, but each person grieves differently, right?
Yeah.
So what you were feeling, was it a shock because you hadn't, I too am similar, I didn't really go through what I consider great grief until later on in life. I had I'm not sorry, parents, grandparents who had passed. But it was, that even started mostly in my early 20s. So was that a shock to you? I mean, you're saying you're feeling bad about it, right? You felt like you weren't doing it
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah, exactly. I felt bad about it because the doctors, they give you the statistics, but they don't give you the emotional side of it. And so I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, and I just assumed it was because something was wrong with me.
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, there definitely was some shock associated with it. And not knowing that I was grieving or having any clue of what to do with it was a really big part of it. After that, my husband and I were able to successfully have a second child. And he was born in January of 2015. And everything seemed great. We had wanted 2 kids. Our life was exactly where we wanted it to be. We were really happy. And about 2 weeks after our second child was born, my husband, who was trying to get into shape, who was a wildland firefighter, very active, avid hunter, um, went and played some basketball. And then he came home and he was going to go for a jog afterwards. And he didn't come into the house because he didn't want to wake up the baby if the baby was sleeping. And it wasn't until about 45 minutes after I had heard him come home that I realized he should have been back by then. He should have been done with his jog and come in. And so I made sure the kids were still asleep and everybody was taken care of, and he was just jogging along our road. So I jumped in the car and I figured I would find him with a broken ankle or some normal injury. And instead, what I found was him on the side of the road, unresponsive. Um, and
Mm.
he was declared dead at that point. And
Right.
so he was 30, I was 31 with a 3-year-old and a 2-week-old.
Okay. So this was not too long, within a year after you found out about the miscarriages. Is that the approximate timestamp?
Yeah, the miscarriages were in the summer and fall of 2013. And this
Okay.
was in February of 2015.
Okay.
So pretty soon after that. And with the miscarriages, I never did until well into learning how to grieve my husband did I realize that I was grieving those miscarriages. So
Mm.
while I was grieving, and I know that now, I still had no skills or any support
Yeah.
on what to do with grief and how to do it. And I was thrust into this situation that I never wanted to be in, and I never thought I would be in.
Right. And it's interesting that you say skills, because we always talk about coping skills. And like I said, grief looks so much different for each person. I think that a lot of times when people have a significant loss, like you had mentioned with the miscarriage, that find they find a place where they might even feel bad about themselves, thinking that, like you said earlier, you might not be doing it correctly, because there's this misconception that grief looks a certain way. It's not only for the griever, but it's also for people around you, because I've heard a lot of people say, hey, aren't you over it by now? It's been X amount of time, and your grief shouldn't look like this any longer. But the thing is that we all have different personalities. We all have different experiences in the way that we deal with the world. So had you grown up seeing things, it may have looked a little different than had things happen to you suddenly and kind of all clumped together. A year sounds like a long time, but it's not, or 2 years even. It's not a long time for several losses. When you have that compound loss, it builds up and it's very hard to deal with. So um, how did you look for those quote unquote coping skills rather, and work on your healthy grieving, trying to help you get through that and identify the grief and emotions that come with that grief? You also have 2 little kids at this point. Here you are having to bury your husband, and you have 2 little kids that you have to think about everything for. So how did that look for you?
It didn't look like much for the first few months. I was blessed that my mom was able to come stay with me. and really helped take care of the kids. And she was wonderful. She gave me my space, which is something I probably wouldn't have expected. But she gave me my space to grieve. And at the same time, she slowly pushed me to do more because I was pretty much in a state of complete shock. I wasn't very functional. I could do the absolute minimum that was required of me, but doing anything extra was just beyond what I was capable of at that point. And she was there, and I think for about 3 months. And after she gave me a number of weeks of just letting me kind of be there, then she slowly got me more involved. Okay, I'm going to bring the kid to preschool. You need to get in the car. You need to go with me. And eventually that led to, okay, it's your turn to go drop the kid off at preschool. It's your turn to go to the store. I'll make dinner, but now you need to wash the dishes, and slowly brought me back into this realm of responsibility. And I would have really struggled if I had to do it completely by myself. And a lot of people do. A lot of people don't have that kind of support. So I was blessed in that sense. Finding the skills, and really, you kind of mentioned it, but skills is such a bad term for it because it's not really something you can learn. And skills suggest that you can learn how to deal with it. For me, it was about finding support, finding people who understood, finding people I could talk to who had gone through it, and seeing how they figured out how to move forward with their lives and get up every day and carry that grief with them and still be functional and happy people. And it was hard for me to find those resources. I don't know if I was just in such a state of grief that using Google was impossible, or if by the time I got any results, that was all the energy I had and I didn't follow through. I think it took me about 3 months, and I had found some Facebook groups, and those were sometimes really good and sometimes really depressing for me. And eventually I found an organization called Soaring Spirits that had a thing called Camp Widow, which sounded so ridiculous, especially for an introvert who doesn't like big crowds and big cities. But I went to this Camp Widow, which is a retreat in San Diego. And there I was able to build a little bit of community and talk to people who were also widowed young, who had small kids, and just bounce ideas off of people. And so that was really huge for me. And I went to that in July of 2015. And so before that, I really didn't have any skills, and I really felt very hopeless a lot of the time and had no idea what to do or who to talk to about it. And after that, I was given a lot of ideas, a lot of resources to look into. And so that was kind of the turning point for me.
I'm so glad that you were able to find a support system. That was one of the things that I had a lot of trouble doing. And that's why I actually started all of these things, this podcast included, was because I too had a hard time finding resources. So now I know several people who have a lot of resources. And for those of you watching on YouTube, I have a dog that just popped up, and we're trying to keep everybody happy and quiet so they're not whining and barking. So this is Sophie, for those of you who might be interested. So anyways, and yeah, so that's the reason I started Faith Breeds Hope. It's the reason I started the Grief Symposium, because I too joined several of those Facebook groups and found that just reading everything and all the loss, it was so heavy. Being that I had that recent loss. So you think, well, I need support, and the best support I can have is with like people, people that have the same loss. And while part of that is true, it is good to relate to somebody else who has a loss. It can also be super, super heavy when so many people are grieving in their own space, because your emotions, especially I guess if you're a really emotional person like me, those emotions just get overwhelmed. And again, you had said that you can't really learn the skills. We grow in our grief. I believe we move forward. We do learn how to do certain tasks, like journaling is a huge deal for a lot of people, that helps them be able to get through their grief. But I want to know more about this idea of how you were able to help your kids, because and you and I have talked before, and that is something that I have struggled with too. So can you tell the audience what that looks like, and what that looked like maybe in the beginning to what it looks like now? Because I'm sure it's different.
Yeah. So early on, like I mentioned, I had a 3-year-old and a newborn. So the newborn, I didn't really need to worry about at that point because they didn't know what was going on, anyways. The 3-year-old was very different because he was very matter of fact about the whole thing. I don't think he ever cried about his dad, which was very unusual because when his dad would be gone, when he was alive, he would say how much he missed him and when is he coming home and ask questions. And after he died, and we explained it to him, and we used very specific words, we used died, dead, not coming back. He'd say things like, hey, this was my dad's lunchbox, but it's yours now because he's dead. Or that was my dad's store, but it's yours now because he's dead. And of course, that just makes you want to completely melt down. But for him, that's how he was processing his grief. And it was in a very matter of fact way. And at that point, because of their young ages, we really focused on just sharing their dad with them. And so we had items made. We had photo books made for each of the boys with pictures of either them with their dad or just pictures in general of their dad so they could know him. We had pillows and blankets and teddy bears and quilts made out of his clothes. We have pictures up in their rooms. So it was very kind of tangible. And then their grief changed. And I guess I'll share more of my story at this point because it's going to help the conversation. I eventually found a person in my community that was helping me grieve. And he was one of the few people I had found that was my age that had experienced any major loss, and he had lost his father. And he was somebody I could talk to and say, can you believe I ran into the store and they told me this? They told me I was young enough I could find somebody else to marry, or I could, all those things that people say with really good intentions that are also really hurtful. And he really became my grieving person. And after a while, that developed into more. And we had a relationship and eventually got married in 2017, much to my surprise. And it was great. And he became a dad to my kids. And we talked a lot about their dad in heaven and how they have a dad in heaven who loved them very much and who still loves them. And we talked about their dad on earth. And we made sure that both of their dads are very much around them. So our dining room looks a little bit different because we have 2 wedding pictures hanging on the wall, which is confusing if people don't know the story. But my current husband and I both felt it was important to show that, hey, yeah, you do have 2 dads and they're both people that loved you and do love you still. And my current husband and I decided we were going to have one more kid and add that to our family, but we weren't really going to focus on it because we were worried about my history with miscarriages and we didn't want to deal with that a lot. So we decided to have another child and we didn't have any issues. And in July of 2018, we had a little girl, Riley Marie, and she was amazing. And we had this meshed family and we were very much a family. And my current husband adopted the boys, but made sure they retained their dad in heaven's name because we live in an area where names are very important and that's a well-respected name in the community. And we wanted to make sure they kept it. And I hyphenated my name because I wanted to have a name that connected me to all of my kids. And life was perfect for about 3 months. And then our daughter got sick and we all had colds and we thought that's what it was. And she was getting a little dehydrated and we went into the hospital and they decided that something else was wrong, but it didn't seem that serious at that point. So they were going to run some tests. And when they went to run a test for meningitis, she coded. And after 40 minutes, they were able to get her heart going again. But after a while, she was declared brain dead. And so at 3.5 months old, we lost our daughter, and my kids, who were 6 and 3 at that time, lost their sister. So of course their grief was very different.
So your children had not only lost their father, and then you know were able to help find somebody that helped you move through life and move through the grieving process, who you invited to share the rest of your life with you, and now you and your children are suffering another loss. Um, as a mom, I know that was devastating to you because I can relate to losing a child. You know, I can relate to miscarriage as well, but losing a child, um, we don't compare in grief. Okay. Mm-hmm. So a miscarriage is a miscarriage. It is a huge loss, and it is something to be honored and understood as a heavy grief. But, you know, for me, just for me, the loss of my living child was harder than the miscarriages that I had gone through, because we fought so hard for her, and she lived to be 10 and a half months old. And anyways, the loss of a child is devastating. I cannot relate to the loss of a spouse, but I do have several friends who can. And now, not only, I'm assuming, are you going through a second, well, 3, 4, 5, a fifth devastating loss, really. So you're trying to figure out how to grieve another time, but you're also probably in the back of your head concerned because your kids are older now. So not only have you had to place these things throughout their life so that they can honor their father and, you know, grieve him, but now you're having to figure out how to pick up the pieces from their sister, correct? So what did that, I mean, did that look like you had to speed through or ignore your own grief so that you could protect the hearts? I know a lot of mothers would do that. They would almost ignore what they were going through because they were trying to take care of their children. I mean, some may look like, hey, you don't get out of bed, you know, but for me, it was different because I too had dependents. I had little ones that really depended on me. And so I felt like personally, I didn't have the option to lay in bed. Now, had she been my very first child, I probably would not have gotten out of bed. I would have been so depressed. But being that I had little ones, my main goal, or, you know, thing that I needed to do was to take care of my kids and make sure that they were all right. In fact, for the first thing I even thought about after she passed away was not about, oh, woe is me, was how am I going to tell my 5-year-old. And so did it look the same for you?
It did. So we ended up being life flighted to a different hospital. So we left our 2 kids with their uncle and aunt and had them continue going to school. And all we told them at that point, because they're 6 and 3, was that your sister is very sick. We have to go somewhere else. Doctors are doing everything they can for her. And that was kind of the line we kept giving them, even when we knew she was declared brain dead. And we did go through an organ donation process with her. So even after we knew she wasn't going to come home, we were in the hospital for about 3 more days. And we made the decision not to have the kids come see her. It's one of those that we had our reasons. We still don't know if that was the right reason or the right choice, but we just tried to protect them and tried to have them stay on some sort of routine, but not go out into the world, because we'd put out prayer requests. So our whole community knew that something pretty bad was going on, even though we weren't specific about it. But yeah, the first thing, I mean, leaving that hospital without her was impossible. But the whole drive, and we had about a 3-hour drive back home, was how do you tell your kids, like you said, how do you tell your kids that their sister's not coming home? And that was probably one of the hardest things I ever had to do. And I do think, in a little bit of a twisted way, I guess, that I was blessed to have been able to find the support and the resources I needed after losing my husband, because I had some tools I knew at this point that it was okay to cry. Versus when I first lost my husband, I thought very much that I needed to be strong and uh, kind of that stereotypical stoic about it because I had kids and I had to take care of them and I had to do all these things and I had to figure out how to live my life. And I think knowing that it was okay to cry and also that I could model healthy grief to my kids was really helpful for me. I didn't want them to see me curled up on the floor crying, which of course happened occasionally, but it was okay to let them see that controlled emotion without scaring them and let them know it was okay to cry. And that was one of the big things we really tried to do was, okay, what's going on? Are you having a bad day? Let's sit here and feel your feelings and talk about it if you want to, or if you want to yell, we can yell. Where we really struggled with the kids and their grief was the ways they displayed it that weren't typical of, or weren't like directly straight line to their grief. They weren't just crying and screaming they missed their sister, which is how our younger kid did it. Our older kid got very aggressive playing with other people. He was in wrestling at that time and he started pushing and biting and being extremely aggressive and getting frustrated a lot quicker. And actually one of the hardest conversations with him when I realized that he actually needed more help than I was able to give him at that point was when we were leaving one practice where he felt he wasn't doing as good as he should. And he goes, you know, you should just kill me. I don't deserve to live here. And of course, as a parent, my first thought is, no, you don't say that. You don't talk like that. And of course, after I calmed down and thought about it, and again, because I think I had those tools of how to deal with grief a little bit, I was able to recognize that, no, if he's having those feelings, we definitely need to know about them and we need to be a safe place for him to talk about them. And he's 9 now, and those types of statements have calmed down quite a bit, but they were pretty relevant for a year or two. And we found him a counselor that he could go talk to, which I do think helped. I think having somebody that he didn't necessarily have an existing relationship with, where he didn't feel like he had to live up to a certain standard or be a certain person, he could just go and talk about what he was going through, really helped with him. But that was one of the biggest struggles.
I can imagine. I mean, with my own children, I see the same thing. The oldest one is angry. Now, in the interesting thing, like you talk about, it's not evident that it's about the grief, and so on the surface, it could just look like, bad behavior. Mm-hmm. But some of the things that they have gone through are so much different than what other people have gone through at their age. And, we all go through circumstances, but like you and I said, that we didn't really go through any heavy loss until we were older, having to go through it at such a young age and not understanding really what's going on. And that really came to light for me a couple years ago. So my daughter is almost 7. And so when she was 5, for about a year off and on, she would cry. And she said she missed her sister. And so we figured, or at least I figured, that it was because she would always say and she still says this. She says she's lonely. She's the only one that has a room all by herself. The boys share a room and she's all by herself. And see, she knows that her sister Isabella would, or at least in her mind as a young child, believes that they would have shared a room. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing is that Isabella was sick, so I'm not sure that they would have shared a room. But had it been a normal pregnancy, or a healthy, I guess I should say, nothing is normal, right? But a healthy pregnancy and healthy childhood, then yes, most definitely, they would have shared a room. And that's exciting, I assume, for a kid, where you have somebody to play with all the time. You have somebody to get in trouble with all the time, and we see that with the boys, but she's kind of the third wheel. And so we were going through that for at least a year openly, where
Mhm.
she would cry and say she missed, and then, where is she? Well, she's gone, she's with Jesus. Well, can you tell Jesus to bring her back? Well,
Yeah.
no, baby, I can't tell Jesus to bring her back, and so that is really a difficult thing, for their brains to wrap it around. And so sometimes I think, I don't know if it's with boys or just older kids, maybe it does come out in anger. But just like kids, I'm assuming, just like with adults, everybody reacts
Mhm.
differently. And so I think that's great that you spent the time to work with your children and to get them the help that they needed, to let them talk openly, to let them cry, if they wanted to scream if they wanted to. You said that you gave yourself permission to cry, and I love that, because a lot of people don't understand that crying is healing. Crying can, be looked at as a sign of weakness,
Mhm.
and for me, I thought the first few months I could cry, but then after, I don't know, something crazy like 3 months, I was like, nope, nobody can see me cry, nobody wants to
Mhm.
hear me talk about it anymore. I mean, what, that is crazy. And and personally, my gut says that if you treat somebody like that, then shame on you.
Yeah.
If you are irritated with somebody about talking about somebody that was that significant to them after just a couple of months, then that's nothing to do with the griever. But anyways, these things all happen differently, and it's good that you have support. But I want to ask you this. You mentioned the crying. What about giving yourself permission to laugh? Was that a big one for you?
I think that was a really big one, especially with my husband. I think I worried a lot about perception, which was something I personally worked on with a coach, because I didn't want people to judge me. I didn't want people to see me dating. And I started dating about 5 months after I lost my husband. And I was really worried that people were going to look at me and be like, oh, well, she obviously didn't love Joe, because God,
Mm.
why, she shouldn't be dating, she should be mourning. Um, and I think laughing was a part of that, because it seems when you're grieving that if you're laughing and people see you laughing, then they're going to assume you're over it and you're better and everything's back to normal and you're not grieving, or because you're having a good time laughing,
Mhm.
that you didn't love the person. And I think a lot of it just really falls into that category of negative self-talk. I was actually surprised that I didn't get a lot of those reactions that I had expected. Um, but the laughing thing, it it took a while to really give myself permission to laugh. And I do think by the time we lost our daughter, we were much better at it, because when we were sitting in the hospital, she had already been declared brain dead. We were laughing. We were in the pediatric intensive care unit waiting for them to find recipients. Um, and we were joking with the doctor. And it was great because the hospital we were in and the staff we were working with didn't seem to look at us like we were completely crazy. I'm not sure what the other patients there felt. Um, but we had learned that laughing doesn't take away from our grief. It makes it a little bit easier to carry. And at that point, we also thought, if Riley is there in that room with us still, or if she's looking down on us, it seems to us that she would much rather see us laughing than crying. And I know people often don't like it when they're told, your person really wants you to do this. Your person would want you to be happy, because
Mhm.
nobody really knows. But for
Right.
us on our own personal level, individually, we kind of decided, what? Yeah, it would make sense that this person that we loved a lot probably loved us also. And seeing us sitting here laughing while we cry, and very probably almost all of the situations we're laughing and crying at the same time, is there's something peaceful about it, really.
I like that. Um, let me ask you this. Well, let me say this. So you have said that letting your kids cry, showing them that you're a real person, allowing yourself to cry, allowing yourself to laugh, letting them scream, whatever it is that they need. Also, you had mentioned with your husband, bringing out those photographs, making books for them so that they can have a piece of him. I think that's a fantastic idea. For me, I wrote my first children's book for my daughter not because I wanted to sell children's books, but because I felt like it would help her cope with her sister's death. So a lot of people, I believe, do things like that. I mentioned already, journaling is a huge thing. Is there any one particular thing that you think, maybe playing games, maybe celebrating a birthday or some kind of significant thing? For instance, for Isabella, her birthday is at the end of January. And so we have a party. And I don't know if that's weird. It's not weird to us, but I make coconut cheesecake every year. The first year it started off with a bunch of people here, and then it has kind of molded into the space where we go out and blow bubbles, we visit her gravesite, we take flowers, whatever it is. And so is it something like that? And then do you feel like that's what you're going to continue to do? Do you think that it will, I'm guessing it'll change as everybody gets older. Can you share that with the audience?
So because the kids were so young, both when their dad died and when their sister died, they don't have a very solid concept of dates as far as when she was born or when she died. And so we don't necessarily do anything on any specific day, especially with the older kid, because of how he handles some of his emotional things. Having a specific day, we decided, may not be as healthy for him. And so we try to just open it up to something that's available anytime. So if where both their dad and their sister are buried is actually on one of their great grandpa's ranch. And so if we're going out there for the day, we give them an opportunity. Hey, do you want to stop? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And it all just kind of depends on the situation. Or we have their photo books out. Hey, do you want to look at this? Do you want to talk about this? We have videos, we have memories, we have a lot of things we can share, all the way up to medical records when they get older. I have medical records if they want to look at them. We have videos of the services. One thing we did for them was when their dad died, I had the newborn, of course, with me because he didn't know what was going on. But the 3-year-old, we didn't have him come to the memorial service because I thought it would be too much. And it might have, maybe it was because I thought it would be too much for me. But we did record it. But for their sister, we knew they both needed to be involved because those services are very much, I don't want to say they provide closure, but they provide a sense of community that can be important. And we really struggled with how to do that for the kids because we knew most parents don't want to bring their kids, especially their younger kids, to memorial services. And what we decided to do, and I have no idea whose idea it was, but it worked out really well, is we said, hey, we want to honor your sister. We want to give her a memorial and have people celebrate her. And so how do you want to celebrate her? And so they did a lot of the planning, and what we ended up with was something completely different than anything I'd seen. And we were able to advertise that, hey, this is a memorial service, but it's going to be a family-friendly memorial service. And so I think probably 20 or 30 other kids that were in that 7 to 5 age group came. And tablecloths were colorful, and there were daisies on the tables, and they wanted 100 balloons. And so we had 100 balloons from Spider-Man to unicorns and Paw Patrol and Care Bears.
Oh, I love it.
Whatever else they picked out. And then they had a bunch of balloons on the floor, and they had a craft station where people could make cards. And so it was such a warming thing because there were kids that were 5, 6, 7 making my kids cards. I'm sorry about your sister.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were just pictures. Sometimes they were just things being like, I like you. Thanks for being my friend. And so there was a craft station, and then they had a bouncy house. So we had this bouncy house set up in the memorial service. And so we could talk about her, and we had our pastor got up and said a few words, and his wife sang a song, and my husband and I stood up and said a few words. But for the most part, we tried to make it so they felt that they could share or they could just play, and it was okay to do both. And I think without knowing it at the time, that really helped set them up to understanding that they can be sad that they don't have their sister, but they can also celebrate that they had her.
Oh, I love it.
So we try to find ways to kind of carry that forward and to continue doing that.
I love it. I love it. We didn't figure that out until later. Like I said, we blow bubbles and we had thought about the balloons, but then we thought about all the environmental things and all. But
yeah,
I allowed my kids to go to the service in the church. Mm-hmm. For me, they were very young as well, but for me, it was more like, I didn't want 20 years to go by if they remembered her and then they started thinking about it and said, I never had a chance to say goodbye. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe that was just my crazy grief brain, but that was where I was at with it. Like I wanted to make sure I had tons of pictures so that they remembered her, that, she was part of our family, or she is part of our family. Yeah. And that, but I did not allow them to go to the burial site. I thought that would be too much to put her in the grounds and stuff. So everybody, like I said before, we've said this several times now, everybody is different. So wrapping up, do you have a book of any kind that maybe you could suggest? So not everybody has the same situation. Maybe not everybody has a budget to have a great party, almost like you did for the sending off celebration for the memorial. Maybe party is not such a great word, but I just was imagining it while you were describing it, and it seemed so light, because grief is so heavy. And I like the idea where you said it allowed them to hold that space for the grief, but it also allowed them to understand, and I'm not going to speak this verbatim, I know that, but it allowed them to understand that there can be a place to move forward. But you just mentioned like that they could celebrate the fact that you had her here for that 3 months. And personally, it took me probably 2 years, even for me, to understand that Isabella's life was a gift, instead of something that was stolen from me. That's kind of the narrative that I held on to for 2 years. And then I finally was able to accept that peace, that peace that surpasses all human understanding, and realize that I was grateful for the time that I had with her, instead of having to dwell and focus on the fact that I would never do this or that with her, So is there any type of book or anything that you would maybe recommend for a parent out there that's just looking, maybe they're struggling?
The best resource I've found really for kids is, it's not necessarily a book, but the Dougy Center. It's DOUGY. And if you search it up, you'll find it. It's an organization that is really focused on helping kids grieve. And it has amazing resources. It has podcasts, so parents can listen to podcasts that talk specifically about grieving children. But it also has this searchable database of activities and almost like handouts, because sometimes when you're dealing with grief, you have to do stuff for your kids and you want to help them, but your capacity also isn't great. Right. So they have 2 or 3 page handouts that people can search both by like the kid's current age, who you are in relation to the kid, what type of loss it was. And you can find things that are very specific. And then they also have like activities, coloring pages for kids and different stories, book recommendations. They have groups kids can join. They have a bunch of resources. I think they've got a whole database on children's grieving groups or centers across the US. And so there's just a ton of resources for grieving with kids that are really helpful.
Wonderful. In just a minute, I want you to tell everybody where they can find you, but I want to just kind of do a quick shout out to some other resources. So we said Soaring Spirits, Camp Widow, right? For the widows out there. And that is in San Diego.
Camp Widow, they actually do one in San Diego, Tampa, and Toronto. They did one in Australia this year. It's getting to be a bigger
Okay.
thing. They also have regional support groups through Soaring Spirits. So there's a lot of
Okay.
additional resources.
And do you just go to soaringspirits.com? Is that
Soaringspirits.org.
org? That makes
Mhm.
sense. Okay. And then you said the Dougie Center, is that online too?
Yep.
DOUGY Center dot, is that org as well?
That's org as well. And
Okay.
that's based in Portland, Oregon. But like I said, they have resources that are national. So
Okay.
um,
And then I want to throw out two other resources that I know for people who are listening. My Grief Connection has a host of resources from my friend Sarah Cobb. She has started this after her own loss. And then Guardian Lane is another resource for children who are grieving. So, Autumn, will you please tell everybody where they can find you?
Yes, I started my own website, which is really just focused on sharing some of these organizations and podcasts and some books that I'd recommend. And that is growingwithgrief.com. And it's just a spot where you can go and hopefully find a resource without having to search all over the internet, because I know that can be so difficult when you're grieving.
Absolutely.
And then, yeah. So I have that. And then I also wrote my memoir in the hopes that maybe my story can help other people. And that is called Boldly Into the Darkness, Living with Loss, Growing with Grief, and Holding On to Happiness. And it's available as an ebook, audiobook, or paperback, wherever you get your book.
Awesome. Wonderful. So thank you so much. Check out her memoir. I'm not going to even try to attempt to redo that title, but we will post it in the show notes, and also go to her website, because I will say this too. It is really difficult when you're right in the middle of grief to want to research, like you had mentioned earlier. Google just doesn't connect with your brain at that point. So it's so great to know that somebody has resources kind of in one space. So thank you so much, Autumn. I really appreciate you being on Faith Breathed Hope.
Great. Thank you very much.
For the rest of you, continue to be blessed and bless others, and I'll see you next time. And I want to thank you for joining us on Faith Breathed Hope, where you gain inspiration and motivation to renew hope and discover purpose in any circumstance. Please like and share this podcast and give us a review on iTunes. Be blessed.